There's a car sitting in garages and old barns right now that people call ugly, boxy, slow, forgettable. And the kind of car your father or grandfather might have driven, and nobody ever asked twice about it. But here's what almost nobody tells you. Without this exact car, something you use every single time you get behind the wheel might not exist, and that thing has quietly saved more than 1 million lives. This is the story of the Volvo Amazon, and before you dismiss it as just another old Swedish sedan, understand this. Inside its own company, before it ever reached a single customer, this car was almost strangled in the crib by the very people who built it. Let's go back to 1956. Volvo had 2 founders, Assar Gabrielsson and Gustaf Larsson, and they did not always agree. When Gabrielsson first laid eyes on the new car his own design team had created, he wasn't impressed. He looked at it and said, half joking, half serious, that it shouldn't be this beautiful. It should be ugly instead. Think about that. The co-founder of the company looked at what would become one of the most important cars in automotive history, and his gut reaction was doubt. Gustaf Larsson saw it differently. He defended the design. He pushed back. And because of that one disagreement between 2 stubborn Swedish businessmen, this car almost never made it to production the way it was designed. Now, here's something that makes this even more remarkable. The man who designed it was 26 years old. His name was Jan Vilsgaard, and this was the first mass-produced car he had ever put his name on for Volvo, 26. This young designer was handed the responsibility of shaping the future identity of an entire car company, and the leadership above him wasn't even sure if his work was good enough. But there's another layer to this story that most car channels skip entirely, because it sounds almost unbelievable. This car wasn't even supposed to be called what most of you think it's called. Originally, Volvo wanted to name it the Amazon, spelled with an S, a tribute to the Amazons, the legendary warrior women from Greek mythology. But there was a problem. A German motorcycle and moped manufacturer called Kreidler already owned the rights to a nearly identical name, Amazon, for one of their own products. Volvo negotiated, and the deal they struck was strange. Volvo was only allowed to use the name Amazon inside the Nordic countries. Everywhere else in the world, this car would not be sold as the Amazon at all. It would carry cold, forgettable numbers instead, 121, 122S, no mythology, no story, just numbers on a badge. So, while people in Stockholm and Oslo were proudly buying their Amazon, drivers in London, in New York, in Sydney, had no idea that was even the car's real name. They were driving a legend with its identity stripped away because of a moped company thousands of miles from any of them. Here's the part that really gets me though. This car everyone dismisses as boring wasn't some lazy design job. It was a deliberate mix of ideas pulled from 3 different continents. The rounded, smooth body style, what car designers call ponton styling, took cues from American cars of the early 1950s. Vilsgaard himself later said he was partly inspired by an American Kaiser he had once seen sitting at the port in Gothenburg. Layer on top of that some Italian curve work and a touch of British restraint, and you get a shape that looked expensive without shouting about it. And that's exactly the risk Volvo was taking. This wasn't a cheap car. It launched, priced at 12,600 Swedish krona. Compare that to Volvo's previous model, the PV 444, which sold for 9,275 krona. That's a massive jump for an ordinary family buyer in the 1950s. Volvo wasn't betting on being the affordable option anymore. They were betting that people would pay more for something built better. That's a dangerous bet in any era. So when it finally debuted at the Gothenburg Motor Show in September of 1956, nobody at Volvo really knew what would happen. Would customers see a beautiful, modern, safer family car worth the extra money? Or would they see an overpriced sedan from a company known for cheaper, boxier models? They got their answer within 24 hours. Over 2,000 orders were placed in a single day. Not over a week. Not over a launch month. One day. For a car that internal leadership had argued about, doubted, and almost redesigned into something duller, the public reaction was immediate. and overwhelming. But here's the twist almost nobody puts in these videos: the styling, the naming drama, the price gamble. None of that is actually the reason this car matters today. All of it is just the setup. Because 3 years after that launch, something happened inside Volvo that had nothing to do with looks and everything to do with survival. Literally. If you're finding this kind of real automotive history interesting, this is exactly the kind of story we dig into on this channel every week. So, make sure you hit subscribe now, so you don't miss what's coming next. And if you remember driving one of these Volvos, or riding in the back seat as a kid, drop a comment below and tell us about it. It genuinely helps this channel grow when you do. Because what happened next inside Volvo wasn't about beauty at all. It was about blood and bone, and a decision that most companies in their position would never have made. Before 1959, seatbelts existed, but they were dangerous in their own strange way. Most cars only offered a simple lap belt, a single strap across the stomach. In a serious crash, that belt didn't just fail to protect you. Sometimes it made things worse. It could crush internal organs as the body was violently thrown forward. People were being saved from flying through the windshield, only to die from injuries the belt itself caused. Volvo knew this was a problem worth solving. So in 1958, they hired someone who had nothing to do with cars at all. His name was Nils Bohlin, and he came from the aerospace industry, where he had spent years designing ejector seats for fighter pilots. Think about that for a moment. The man who would go on to redesign how ordinary families stayed safe on the road had spent his career figuring out how to keep a human body intact at the edge of survival, thousands of feet in the air. Bohlin looked at the problem differently than the automotive engineers before him had. Instead of one strap across the stomach, he designed a belt that crossed both the chest and the hips, forming a V shape that could be fastened with a single hand. It sounds simple now. It wasn't simple then. This design spread crash force across the strongest parts of the human skeleton, instead of concentrating it on soft internal organs. In 1959, Volvo installed this new three-point belt as standard equipment, starting with the PV 544 and rolling it out across their lineup, including the Amazon. For the very first time, a major manufacturer was making this level of protection standard, not an expensive extra you had to pay more to get. On a Tuesday morning in August of 1959, the very first car fitted with this new belt, as standard equipment, rolled out to a dealer in the small Swedish town of Kristianstad. No headlines, no press conference, just an ordinary delivery that would, decades later, be recognized as one of the most important moments in the entire history of the automobile. Now here comes the part of this story that should genuinely stop you for a second. Volvo patented Bohlin's design. That patent alone could have made the company an enormous amount of money for decades. Every single competitor who wanted to use a similar three-point belt would have had to pay Volvo for the right to protect their own customers. Volvo said no to that money. They opened the patent, for free, to every car manufacturer on the planet. Let that sink in. A private company, in an industry built on competition and profit, looked at a technology that could save lives and decided that money mattered less than making sure every driver, in every car, regardless of brand, had access to it. So what actually happened because of that decision? This isn't guesswork, and it isn't marketing spin from Volvo. Independent estimates put the number at over 1 million lives saved worldwide since that patent was opened up. 1 million. Not injuries reduced, not damage avoided, lives. People who walked away from crashes that would have killed them under the old lap belt system. Think about the math for a second, because it's staggering when you actually sit with it. If Volvo had kept that patent locked down and charged even a small licensing fee for every car built using a three-point belt design, they would have collected money from nearly every car manufactured on Earth for decades. Instead, they gave the industry, and by extension, every single one of us, a piece of engineering worth more than money could measure. And here's something that connects directly to you, watching this right now. If you learn to drive any time from the 1960s onward, in almost any car, in almost any country, The belt you clicked into place before pulling out of the driveway traces its design directly back to this decision, not a vague influence, not a distant inspiration. The actual shape of the strap across your chest and your hip, right now, in whatever car you own, exists because Volvo chose not to keep it for themselves. This is the part of the Amazon story that never gets told alongside the design gossip and the naming drama. The car people call boring, the car one of its own founders wanted to make uglier, was the vehicle that carried the most important safety decision in automotive history out into the world. The German Patent Office has since ranked this design among just a handful of patents, out of millions filed since 1885, considered to have had the single greatest importance to humanity. Beauty didn't save 1 million lives, a decision did, and it happened inside a car most people today wouldn't even recognize if they saw one parked on the street. There's real proof behind this, not just a good story. Years after the belt was introduced, Bolin published a study covering 28,000 road accidents. Out of more than 37,000 people involved in those crashes, not a single person wearing a 3-point belt died, unless the vehicle was traveling above roughly 60 miles per hour. Read that again. At normal driving speeds, the belt Volvo gave away for free was, essentially, the difference between walking away and not walking away at all. And this wasn't a one-time win that faded over the decades. In the United States alone, safety regulators estimate that seatbelts continue to save more than 11,000 lives every single year, decades after Bolin first sketched that V-shaped design on paper. Every one of those lives connects back, in some way, to a decision made inside a Swedish car company that most people today associate only with a boxy, unremarkable-looking sedan. Now let's talk about what happened to the car itself, because the story doesn't end with the seatbelt. Production continued for well over a decade after that first Gothenburg reveal. Volvo kept building on the original 4-door design, and in September of 1961, they added a 2-door version, which became especially popular back home in Sweden, where 2-door cars were the norm at the time. Then, at the Stockholm Motor Show in February of 1962, the family got even bigger with the arrival of an estate version, complete with a split tailgate design borrowed loosely from American station wagons. By the time production finally ended in July of 1970, Volvo had built roughly 667,000 of these cars in total. 234,653 were 4-door models. 359,917 were 2-door models. 73,220 were estates. And here's a detail that says everything about how far this boring car actually traveled. Around 60% of them were exported out of Sweden entirely. There's one more version worth knowing about, especially if you ever come across one at a car show. In 1967, Volvo built a limited run of a sportier variant called the 123 GT, fitted with a more powerful engine borrowed from their sports car line. Only about 5,000 of these were ever made. Today, among collectors, that specific version is considered the most desirable Amazon you can find. There's one more piece of this safety story worth knowing, because it shows this wasn't a single lucky decision. It was a pattern. In that same era, Volvo's president was married to a physiotherapist named Margit Engelau, who spent her days treating accident victims at a hospital in Gothenburg. She kept seeing the same injury, again and again, whiplash, from heads snapping backward with nothing to stop them. She brought that observation home to her husband, Gunnar Engelau, Volvo's own president. By 1970, the same year the last Amazon rolled off the production line, head restraints were standard equipment in every Volvo built. One conversation at a kitchen table between a physiotherapist and the man running a car company quietly protected the necks and spines of millions of people who never knew her name either. By the mid-1960s, this design had already done its job. It laid the foundation for everything Volvo built afterward, shaping the sturdy, safety-first reputation the brand still leans on today, decades after the last Amazon rolled off the line. Now think about your own life for a second. If you're old enough to remember cars before seatbelts were mandatory, Or you remember your father explaining why you had to click that belt before the car would even move. You lived through the exact transformation this story describes. You weren't reading about it in a history book. You were the generation this decision was made for. And that's what makes this story different from most car history you'll find online. This isn't really about a Swedish sedan from the 1950s. It's about a choice made by ordinary people inside a car company to protect strangers they would never meet at a cost to their own bottom line. In a business world that constantly tells us profit comes first, this is proof that it doesn't always have to. There's a lesson buried in here that goes beyond cars entirely. The Amazon wasn't celebrated for being flashy. It wasn't the fastest car of its era, or the most glamorous. It won by being solid, by being trustworthy, and by carrying something inside it that mattered more than how it looked in a showroom window. How many things in your own life get judged the same unfair way? Written off as boring or old-fashioned, when the substance underneath is actually what holds everything together. That's the real reason this ugly Volvo deserves to be remembered. Not because of its curves, or its badge, or the argument between two founders over how it should look. It deserves to be remembered because somewhere inside that boxy, unglamorous body, a decision was made that quietly protects you, right now, every single time you get in a car and pull that belt across your chest. Look around at everything you own that's still working after 20, 30, even 40 years. Chances are, none of it was the flashiest option on the shelf when you bought it. It was built by people who cared more about it lasting than about how it looked in a showroom window. That's not nostalgia talking. That's simply how well-made things have always survived. Most people watching this will get in a car sometime in the next 24 hours. When you do, and you reach for that belt without even thinking about it, I want you to actually notice it for once. Notice the shape of it, crossing your chest and your hip in that same V pattern Niels Bohlin worked out over 60 years ago. That small, automatic motion, the one you've done thousands of times without a second thought, exists because a car company decided that saving strangers mattered more than protecting a patent. That's the story people miss when they look at an old Volvo Amazon and call it ugly, or slow, or forgettable. They're looking at the surface. They're missing what's underneath. And honestly, that happens with more than just old cars. It happens with people too. We judge the exterior, the packaging, the first impression, and we walk right past the thing that actually matters. If this kind of story, the real history behind machines and decisions that shape the world we live in now, is something you want more of, this channel exists for exactly that. We dig past the surface-level facts everyone already knows, and we find the parts of the story that actually explain why something matters today. And if you're new here, welcome. This isn't a channel obsessed with horsepower numbers or top speeds nobody will ever reach on a public road. It's a channel for the stories underneath the metal, the decisions, the people, the moments nobody ever put on a brochure. So, if you haven't already, subscribe now, so these stories keep showing up for you. And before you go, do two more things. Drop a comment below and tell us what stuck with you most from this one. Was it the founder who wanted the car to be uglier? The naming fight with a moped company? Or the seatbelt decision itself? I read these, and it genuinely shapes what we cover next. If this video actually taught you something you didn't know, hit like. And if you know someone, a friend, a brother, someone who'd appreciate a story like this, send it their way. The Volvo Amazon never tried to be the most beautiful car on the road. It didn't need to be. It carried something inside it that outlasted every trend, every rival, and every doubt its own founders once had about it. And more than 1 million people, most of whom never even knew the car's name, are alive today because of it.